Hi, and welcome to Mortal Giants. I'm Sandy Garasino, and this podcast is produced in collaboration with Canada's National Observer. Episode 2, The Microchip Monopoly.
Your Spotify suggestion algorithm, Google Maps, e-payments, social media. Hey Siri, the things we use to run our lives and schedule our day run on AI. All AI uses advanced semiconductors, and almost all of those chips come from one island. NBC reports Taiwan produced over 60% of all semiconductors and almost 93% of the most advanced chips needed for AI on the planet and in orbit. Even your toaster has one. But how complex are they? Chris Miller, author of Chip War, spoke at MIT and explained how intricate these tiny little chips can get.
If you go to the Apple store down the street and buy a new iPhone, inside that iPhone, there will be a dozen or so semiconductors. And the most important chip inside of an iPhone, the main application processor, will have carved into the silicon 15 billion transistors. 15 billion transistors. And to fit 15 billion transistors on a chip the size of your fingernail, each one of them is smaller than the size of a coronavirus.
The one company to build them all and the one company to design them is TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. The man behind TSMC's success is Morris Chang, who comes from humble beginnings.
A
lot of people don't know that just a few hours after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they attacked Hong Kong as well. And I was in Hong Kong. I was a 10-year-old, of course, living with my parents. And then after that, of course, the Japanese occupied Hong Kong. Second World War was over in 1945, and we were able to go back to Shanghai. However, just in 3 years, it all changed because the communists started to take over China, and we had to flee again. And that was 1948, and this time it seemed to be permanent.
As the world takes notice and the scales begin to shift, the race to determine the future powerhouse of advanced semiconductor production begins.
Today I'm signing the law of the Chips and Science Act, a once-in-a-generation investment in America itself.
One of the voices you've just heard was Morris Chang, who shared his story about fleeing Hong Kong and China as a teenager for studies at MIT and a future in America. 10 years later, he would be present at the very moment of creation, the invention of the world's first semiconductor at Texas Instruments in 1958. Eventually, Chang would become preeminent at building microchip fabrication plants, or fabs as they're called, for Texas Instruments. And he had one big idea, one dream really. Morris Chang wanted to build fabs to make microchips for any company in the world that couldn't afford to make their own. But he couldn't get buy-in. Not at Texas Instruments, not anywhere in Silicon Valley. Nobody wanted to support this. And by 1985, Morris Chang was pretty much out of options and out of hope for that dream when his phone rang. "Tell me how much money you need," said the voice from the other side of the world. It was Taiwan calling. And Taiwan would write Morris Chang a blank check to launch the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company and change the world. This is Mortal Giants. I'm Sandy Garasino.
And I'm Veena Najabola.
And we're going to talk about power and risk in the modern world. You know, Veena, when I was a kid, any product labeled Made in Taiwan was considered a dime store trinket that would break before bedtime. That label meant one thing: cheap kid stuff. Well, those days are long gone. And there's really no way to look at China's strategy and ambitions without exploring the stark clash with American power embodied by President Joe Biden's export controls and the Chips and Science Act. Veena, what are the essential features of that legislation? What is the U.S. targeting here and why?
It's essentially a commitment of $52.7 billion to bring back some of the manufacturing and production of semiconductor chips back to the U.S. in the last couple of decades, US has really lost its edge when it comes to the manufacturing side of the semiconductor value chain. US still has a lead when it comes to design of these chips, particularly US companies like Intel, Nvidia, and others are still leading the design. But when it comes to manufacturing of the semiconductor chips, which, as you said, are foundational to everything that we have, both commercially, but also in terms of the national security, military, defense technologies, all depend on semiconductor chips. Now it's other countries, particularly the island nation of Taiwan, that dominates the production of the most advanced semiconductor chips. In fact, 92% of the most advanced semiconductor chips are now produced in Taiwan.
Those are the really crucial ones that are essential to
well,
smartphones.
Actually, they all matter, but yes, the cutting edge is considered 7 nanometers and below, and TSMC in Taiwan is uniquely positioned to produce those now. So the CHIPS Act is actually trying to bring back some of that production by opening up fabrication plants in the US, in Arizona, in Ohio, New York. It's an attempt to both obviously compete with China when it comes to making sure that we have the technological lead, but it's also an industrial policy in that it tries to bring back manufacturing jobs to the US. So it meets a Biden administration's commitment to the kind of reindustrialization of the American heartland. It's called like the Silicon Heartland, right? To bring back good jobs to the US. Yeah. But it also has obviously at its heart a desire to reduce vulnerability on this critical supply from one place, namely Taiwan, because of the geopolitics of Taiwan relations.
One of the things that's so remarkable about this story is how the awareness was brought to light largely by the pandemic. Yes. That's when we started to see the supply chain, the chaos in the supply chain. And this is when we started to realize, and what was the central thing? And what were we hearing about? It was the microchips. Where were the semiconductors?
Medical supplies as well, critical minerals, right? So basically during COVID, we discovered that supply chain security is critical, especially in certain areas, right? Like not everything, but you're right. Semiconductor chips were one of them because of cars. And for cars, you don't need the most advanced ones. You need actually kind of the regular.
Basic.
Yes, but even that shortage ended up having a disruption on the entire car manufacturing industry here in North America and elsewhere. Same with critical minerals as well, and then EV batteries as well.
And it's worth taking a few minutes to explore how Taiwan got into the middle of this fight. And what we're seeing now is the fruit of a remarkable pairing of government foresight and brilliant business execution. What they set out to do, and this was a national policy. We want to become a linchpin in electronics manufacturing. Yes. If we can do that, we can kind of secure a key strategic position. Yeah. They recruited and brought back Morris Chang, who was the founder of TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and other key individuals were lured back by the Taiwan government to please come back and get started.
And they've developed a very impressive ecosystem for that kind of.
They aren't the only, I mean, there are other manufacturers that are really crucial in the semiconductor whole ecosystem.
Also in Asia, in South Korea and Japan.
Also the Netherlands, ASML. But it's so fascinating how Taiwan had this foresight, and they have now, because TSMC now manufactures over 90% of these advanced semiconductors, which are absolutely crucial, not only for smartphones and Internet of Things, for AI, for the development of so much that is lying ahead in the future. So crucial to the US to protect it, but also a key target for China, no?
There would be massive economic disruption if there were to be conflict in Taiwan Strait, or if China were to in fact invade Taiwan, is a huge calculation. But I don't think we should reduce the tensions between Taiwan and China to just economic interests. It's not. The idea that China needs to reunify with Taiwan, or the commitment that Chinese leadership, particularly the Chinese Communist Party, has to the reunification is much bigger and has deeper roots than just economic interest. It's ideological. It's a belief that the rejuvenation of China cannot be complete without this reunification.
And we're going to be talking about that in another episode.
Absolutely.
But it is fascinating how critical
there is an economic dimension.
This
yes.
And what's so interesting to me is that we were just kind of going along, buying our smartphones, getting our cars, doing our things, ordering a new TV, a smart TV, all this kind of thing, and without awareness of how crucial this one particular
Absolutely.
part of the manufacturing chain is. We've talked about the CHIPS Act and about Biden's and the American desire to get manufacturing, to reinvigorate the manufacturing sector in the U.S.
Yes.
Do you think this can work? I mean, one of the things that's so fascinating about this sector is this is an incredibly expensive undertaking.
Yes.
And one can sense from a lot of the experts in the field a certain skepticism. I mean, all of this seemed really exciting at the time that Biden passed the CHIPS Act, but there's a certain skepticism that America is really going to be able to compete with Taiwan and to really develop its semiconductor manufacturing to the level that would really answer this strategic problem of Taiwan's essential role.
I don't think we're trying to sort of compete with Taiwan, right? Like the competition is with China, but there is a desire to reduce our dependence or over-dependence on Taiwan as the only producer of these chips, right? So therefore you're seeing agreements and collaboration with TSMC to open up fabs in the US, to open up fabs in Germany and in Japan, right? So this is also very much done in collaboration with TSMC as a key partner to bring production outside of Taiwan,
while also not just to the U.S., but
also to Japan and Germany at the moment, and perhaps others in the future. But it would allow TSMC still to retain quite a bit of production in Taiwan. At most, it will reduce that dependence or overdependence from 92%, let's say, to 60%, right? Like Taiwan will continue to be critical in the production of semiconductors. But the effort is not just about production. It's also, obviously, if you look at the CHIPS and Sciences Act, there's also a commitment to research and development. There's a commitment to having more STEM students. There's a commitment to having more talent, nurturing talent, both through immigration, but also through homegrown talent in the US, right? So it's a long-term commitment, which is also linked to the other legislative initiatives like the IRA and the infrastructure bill that Biden administration passed. It's a new economic doctrine, if you will. It's a new Washington consensus that says industrial policy is central to innovation, is central to maintaining our economic security, and is central to economic prosperity. This CHIPS and Science Act, the $52 billion, has to be seen in conjunction with all these other efforts that are happening in the US, but are also happening in Europe, in Japan, in Taiwan, and so forth.
And it's interesting, China is now in this race in a big way as well.
Well, they've been in it before us.
They knew about it before we did, but they have not successfully, not successfully producing at the level that TSMC is. And now TSMC is advancing even further ahead. It's now down to, I'm understanding that it's down
3
to 3
nanometers.
How small is a nanometer? Used for atomic measurements in science, a nanometer is 1 times 10 to the negative 9th meters, which is 1/billionth of a meter.
But there's another part of this. There's the CHIPS and Science Act, which is about onshoring and I guess the friendshoring and also developing a global strategy to reduce reliance, reduce vulnerability. And that's largely an economic agenda.
Yes.
But there's something else too, which is the export controls.
Yes.
And
you alluded to this at the beginning of your question when you mentioned that China is in this game as well, right? So yes, absolutely. China has been trying to indigenize its production of semiconductors, high-end technology. In some respects successful, but in others not successful. And if you actually really think about that, China is investing almost equivalent to a CHIPS Act, around $40 billion per year since 2015. So this has been a huge investment and subsidy to their domestic capacity, which, some success, but also it's showing the limits of an industrial policy alone, right? That the industrial policy has to work in conjunction with private sector investment, that it's not just about kind of pouring in public money. There has to be the ecosystem for innovation and an ecosystem for partnership with the private sector, which I think the Biden administration is trying to do. And although we're kind of learning from China in that we are bringing in industrial policy, we're hopefully doing it in a smarter way and doing it in a way that takes advantage of the free societies that we live in, innovation, private sector, and all the rest of it. So that's on that piece. In terms of the export controls, it's a recognition that in addition to investing in our own, and by our here, I mean US and Western allies capacity, we also need to address the fact that we cannot have American and Western technologies propel Chinese military advancement, because China is a rival, China is a geopolitical competitor. So American technology should not power Chinese military, which could one day potentially be an adversary.
Well,
right?
and China is arming itself
yes,
at an
absolutely.
extraordinary rate.
So that's the idea behind export control, is that there is a national security imperative to ensure that there is no leakage of American technology to China, which could be used for military purposes and could eventually sort of be an issue on the battlefield for us. It's a surgical approach to essentially forbid access to certain technologies by Chinese companies. And it's done in collaboration with Japan and Netherlands, which are critical because, as you pointed out earlier, Netherlands, because of ASML, this one particular company that is critical in the equipment that is necessary to produce the semiconductor chips, the lithography equipment. In fact, they have 100% monopoly. So it was really critical to have Netherlands on board.
They're another choke point.
So Netherlands does not export this technology for the manufacturing of semiconductors to China. And then it was also important to get Japan on board. So yes, export controls were quite remarkable because they were unprecedented. It was the first time that we said, not only will we invest in our own technological edge and advancement, but we will also make sure that China stays behind on certain technologies, 2-3 generations behind the West and the US in particular. And for that, we're banning the sale of advanced semiconductors to China and to Chinese companies. It's 1 year in the making, so there's still a lot of exemptions. In fact, South Korean and Taiwanese company TSMC has an exemption that was granted to them for a year. We'll see what happens long term, but it was quite a significant piece of legislation. And when it was passed, not legislation, an executive order, and when it was passed, there was a lot of worry that there might be retaliation from China. And China's response has been quite measured. There hasn't been any retaliation.
How do you think China is perceiving this? How effective do you think these controls will be? And what is the impact on China's, its own Silicon Valley, as it were, its own ability to advance and compete when there is this shutdown of material support? How do you think that's playing out?
I mean, it's difficult to say. There are obviously experts who say that this will just speed up China's commitment and desire to become self-sufficient and self-reliant and indigenize these capacities and productions. There are experts who say it's just too complicated and there's no way that China will keep up and that this is catch up and that this will have a significant economic effect on China. I think 1 year is too short of a time to tell, especially...
It's hard to bet against China.
Yes,
but this is an extremely
unusual situation, right? So, but I mean, we'll see what's the conclusion on Huawei's latest phone, because you've probably seen that Huawei has released a phone that uses 7-nanometer chips, which, if that was in fact produced domestically, that would be a huge breakthrough, because the desire of the export controls that were put in place last year was to keep China at around 14-nanometer chip production, right? So this would already show a breakthrough if in fact it was achieved through domestic capacity rather than stockpiling of stuff before the bans come into effect or some kind of an IP theft or violations of export controls, right? So there has not been yet a clear conclusion on how Huawei arrived at this latest product.
Well, and that's going to be, and can they produce in mass quantities? Because that's one of the other key elements about TSMC, the Taiwanese company's production
Scale.
It's extreme accuracy at massive scales.
Yeah.
This story of competition and IP goes back a long way.
Absolutely. And certainly even with Huawei, we know that there are Canadian companies that were implicated in Huawei's rise. Canadian companies' demise is connected to Huawei.
Canadians will remember Nortel, this incredible giant that was completely infiltrated. It was leaked like a sieve because they had such completely inadequate security controls, and it led to the complete collapse of Nortel, which was a big deal for Canada. So we definitely have reason to feel that this issue around cyber competition, cyber production, and maintaining that edge is important, not just to the United States, but to Canada as well.
Absolutely. No, I mean, the issue of technological competition, or this kind of race to be the technological leader and to make sure that the technologies of tomorrow and today, when it comes to AI, quantum, biotech, all of this, that US and its allies maintain the lead is now critical, right? Because technological superiority is going to be critical to national power, right? And to general geopolitical competition between US and China. This is the kind of the first battleground, if you will. I mean, the competition with China began with Trump's trade war, but I think it really heated up with the tech war that's now ongoing, and the Biden administration has doubled down and in some ways has put in place smarter strategies that bring U.S. allies on board as well. I think lots of people worried that the U.S. would do unilateral export controls and unilateral efforts to move on this. And they've shown that they're very keen to bring key allies. And they have to in some ways, right? Because U.S. is not the dominant player. It is in some areas, but it really needs its allies. It needs Taiwan, it needs Japan, South Korea, Netherlands, Germany, EU as a whole around this. And then, of course, we haven't spoken about this, but another critical element in all of this are critical minerals, right?
Yes.
So that you need, in countries like Canada, we may not be a big player in the semiconductor value chain, but we are players when it comes to the materials that are going into creating these technologies of tomorrow. So I think even there, US has been quite good at creating multilateral, minilateral, or kind of plurilateral agreements.
Symphonic.
with its partners, and Canada can play a role there.
Yeah. China has had kind of a mixed relationship with its tech sector. You know, people who are being educated, say in Silicon Valley, who might have in the past wanted to go home and wanted to work in China and work in developing this, are they now going to be staying on site in the U.S. and developing in the U.S.
This
sector?
is a really good question. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that the space for real innovation and for creative scientific work in China is shrinking. But we also have to be cautious that we don't do the same here in the West, right?
Yeah.
Like some of the immigration policies and some of the growing anti-Asian racism, I think could be really detrimental to a number of things, obviously to our democracy and open society, but it also to this agenda of making sure that we win the tech race with China, right? Because we do need those scientists. We do need that talent, and that talent is global, and we have to stay open to that immigration.
We have to do that, and we have to, because what's the one thing that we know about the tech sector is how incredibly reliant it has been on immigration. Talent
from China, talent from India, from Asia, global talent. This idea, and I think a lot of American policymakers understand that, right? That has been a strength. This notion of a free society that attracts the brightest and the best talent from around the world
and then keeps
is
them.
Central to U.S. economic prosperity, and we have to maintain that as we obviously also tighten laws around espionage and foreign interference and all the rest of it, right? So this is not to say that there is no issue with issues around foreign interference and needing to protect IP and all the rest of it. But we can't also have such a broad policy that leads us into trouble when it comes to immigration and retaining talent.
And a new tech era is upon us that will affect our lives in ways we don't yet see or understand. Artificial intelligence will be the defining technology of our generation, and America's leadership on AI depends on its control of cutting-edge microchips. From smartphones to the most advanced weapons systems in the world, this is not a race either China or America can afford to lose. This has been a Teeny Turner production in collaboration with Canada's National Observer. It was researched, written, hosted, and produced by me, Sandy Garasino, and Eric Chapman. Editing, sound design, and engineering by Eric Chapman, with special thanks to Sandra Bartlett and Linda Solomon of Canada's National Observer. Please subscribe and share on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Tell your friends and give us a rating. That's how we build an audience. And why not subscribe to Canada's National Observer? That way you won't miss a thing.